So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I wanted to present joint work today with Shubhashita Basu, Vikas Kawai, and Lauren Schmitz. Our paper is focusing on the association between early life conditions, late life cognition. There has been a lot of work done on this, and as has been mentioned previously, a majority of this evidence comes from high-income countries like the US, Sweden, Norway. And some of the key markers of early life conditions that have been utilized to study this association have been indicators associated with health and nutrition, education, family, socioeconomic status, and the experience of stressful or adverse events during childhood. I should mention that there was a recent paper, thanks to the availability of HRS type data in low and middle income countries, that showed that childhood socioeconomic status has important implications for cognitive impairment among older Indians using the LASI data. But again, some of these markers are similar to the ones that have been used earlier in terms of education and family socioeconomic status. Our claim here in this paper is that countries like India provide a unique lens to study these early life conditions and how they relate to cognition because of high prevalence of certain type of early life conditions that are typically not experienced by children in high-income countries, such as child marriage, adolescent childbearing, and child labor. Just to give you a sense, the legal age of marriage in India was increased to 18 years only in 1978. The prevalence of girls getting married before age 18 was approximately 47% until as late as 2005 and 2006. Similarly, according to the 2011 Indian census, there were about 10 million working children between the age of 5 and 14, which is about 4% of children in this age group. And these indicators have been improving consistently over time. India has been doing better. So we can sort of safely assume that when we look at the current cohort of older Indians, the conditions for them with regard to some of these measures were much worse. Now coming to cognition, approximately 7.4% of Indians who are 60 years and older are estimated to have dementia, about 9 million individuals. And previous work has shown that there is a significant education gradient in dementia prevalence among older Indians. However, when we predict cognition with it, using education, in a typical regression setup, we may obscure patterns that are generated by the experience of some of these life events that could shape trajectories or create cumulative disadvantage over the life course. So there could be selection in terms of which, some people could experience these early life conditions and also low education, or there could be a mediating effect, whereas because of these early life conditions, there is low educational attainment and therefore impact on cognitive impairment or cognition later in life. I should mention that there was a recent paper by Jain et al. In 2022, which explored the female disadvantage in cognition in older adults in India. So sort of getting to this similar idea as ours, they accounted for education and a state level gender inequality index. But I should mention here that the state level inequality measure does not accurately capture early life conditions because they use the state of current residence for these older adults. Further, and most importantly, from our perspective, early life conditions can have multiple dimensions. So there may be person level heterogeneity across these domains that can have important implications for cognition. So you can imagine that those that were married early but had children later may fare better on late life cognition than those who were married early and also had children early. And we know very little about how these different indicators of early life conditions cluster together within older Indians and potentially affect cognition. And so with that, we have 3 research questions that we aim to explore in this paper. The first is to identify multifaceted patterns of early life conditions among older Indians, separately for men and women based on timing of marriage, childbearing, and work commencement. And then we want to examine the association between membership in different early life subtypes and late life cognition, and the extent to which education attainment mediates and moderates the relationship between membership in different early life subtypes and late life cognition. So our data comes from LASI, which is India's first nationally representative aging study. It surveys health, economic, and social well-being, I think, of over 70,000 adults who are 45 years and older in India. The main sort of dependent variable that we will use later is cognitive function, which is we measure it using a general cognitive factor score, which is a broad Summary score, it captures multiple cognitive domains. The way this measure is constructed is that it uses data from cognitive tests that were administered as part of the LASI main interview, but also those that were part of the Harmonized Diagnostic Assessment of Dementia, or LASI DAD study, which is an in-depth study of late life cognition for a subsample of LASI participants. And the LASI DAD protocol includes a variety of different tests, and also includes some tests, all the tests that overlap with the main LASI interview. So that allows us to sort of leverage information from the more intensive screening of LASI DAD for the full LASI cohort. And the best benefit of it is that the general cognitive factor score is to a large extent not sensitive to items dependent on literacy. This is not something we do in this study. This is something that has been done and covered in previous studies by other researchers. But that's the measure that we use in this study. For early life conditions, we use questions that LASI respondents are asked about age of first marriage, first child, age first work. So, for example, they're asked, how old were you when you first got married? At what age did you start working or farming? And the question is specific to exclude, working after school or during breaks. And then, it asks about the age of each child, even those that died. And from that, we're able to back out the timing of the first child. So we also have some other covariates in terms of, we use education, age, childhood health status, caste, and rural residence. So just to give you a sense of our summary statistics, as you can see here and has been covered in some of the other papers, that are out there, there's a huge female disadvantage in cognition and in education. With regard to early life conditions, we see that there is, a high percent of women who reported not working, but it was negligible for the amount of men, less than 1%. So we deleted them for the first, take on this analysis. You also see that the relative to women, there are less men who marry early or have children early. Our main methods are basically, we start with a latent class analysis, and essentially an LCA allows us to identify mutually exclusive latent groups, basically the subtype of individuals. We use these 3 early life indicators, and we have plans to use some additional indicators as well as LASI has, but this analysis is based on these 3 indicators. We estimate a series of models. We incrementally increase the number of latent classes, and we pick the optimal number of classes using AIC, BIC values. And after we finalize our preferred model, we can examine some other things like unconditioned probabilities, and the most important ones, which are conditional item probabilities, which we use to label and interpret our classes. And essentially, this is the probability of a positive response on an observed indicator given membership in a particular class. So once we have these classes, we essentially run a multiple regression, and we predict cognition with, first starting with just class membership and age, and then incrementally adding education to see if, education sweeps away all variation that was coming from class membership. And then, some other covariates, and then finally, all the variables and an interaction between education and class membership. So here are the LCA results for women. We iteratively estimated 5 class models. The 3 class model was chosen based on the lowest AIC, BIC values. On the left side, you have these conditional item probabilities graphed out. Essentially, what this shows you is that across these 3 classes, there was this first class, which was about 30% of the sample, which had extra responsibility across all domains of marriage, childbearing, and work in early and teenage years. So you see that they are more likely to be married relative to, both the other classes don't have any of this. So this is the only class where you have early marriage or teenage marriage, and then early childbearing or teenage childbearing, and work also in early and teenage years for the most part, and lowest likelihood of not working. Class 2, which is in orange, shows us teenage marriage but mixed sort of childbearing and work. And class 3, which is the green, shows that marriage and childbearing in adulthood, but sort of a mix for work. On the right-hand side, you see some means. So essentially, class 3 has the highest cognition score, and class 1 has the lowest. The key difference is early marriage and childbearing. Classes 2 and 3 have similar work trajectories. They mostly work, teenage, adult years, but different marriage and childhood trajectories. Class 2 has high prevalence of teenage marriage and teenage childbearing relative to class 3. And there's a big difference in cognition score as well. So it appears that for women, early marriage and childbearing appears to lead to a cognition disadvantage as compared to age of work. For men, we iteratively estimated 5 class models. The 4-class model was chosen based on the lowest AIC level and substantial interpretability. As you can see, there's only one class, only class 1, had child marriage, and no class had early childbearing. We have these 4 classes graphed out here. The blue, the first one, class 1 blue, is similar to the previous graph that we showed for women. Extra responsibility across, marriage, childbearing in teenage years, and work mostly in early and teenage years. Class 2 is orange, which is a mix for marriage and childbearing, but teen work. And then class 3 is green, which is marriage and childbearing in adulthood with some child labor. And then class 4, the last one, is a mix for marriage, but has adult childbearing and mostly adult work. So compared to women, most men are older at the age of marriage and childbearing. Classes 1 and 3 have low cognition scores compared to class 4, which has the highest. Class 1 has high prevalence of early teen marriage and childbearing relative to all categories. And both classes 1 and 3 have high prevalence of work commencement in childhood. So despite having some teenage marriage, if you look at classes 2 and 4, have higher cognition scores, but they also have no prevalence of work commencement in childhood. Class 2 is relatively a little bit worse off in terms of cognitive scores with respect to class 4. It has the same patterns of marriage and childbearing, but class 2 has teenage work. So it appears that for men, early work commencement appears to lead to a cognitive disadvantage. So here are some results from our regression. We essentially did this separately for men and women, and we predicted cognition as a function of first just the classes and age. And we found that belonging to these classes, the more disadvantaged classes relative to the more advantaged classes has a negative association with cognition. This association went away when we added education for the second class, which was in the middle of the spectrum. But for the most disadvantaged class, it remained. And it continued to be negatively, it was small, quite a bit smaller, but it continued to be statistically significant. And then, when we added other factors, we see a similar pattern. And then, when we include the interaction, we see that the interaction term is positive, which basically shows us that the gain in cognition for classes 1 and 2 with the addition of education is much higher than class 3. The additional years of education is much higher than for class 3. We saw a similar pattern for men, as we add education, the class 2, is no longer statistically significant in column 2. Classes 1 and 3 with some child labor continue to be negatively associated with the cognition score, and we see positive coefficients on the interactions. When we look at the predicted margins, we see that, so we're comparing class 1, class 3, and class 2 and class 3 for women. And we see that somewhere around middle school, there is this flip, which is what is giving us this positive coefficient where each additional year of education is actually meaning more in terms of cognition score for the disadvantaged classes relative to the advantaged class. And we see something similar for men as well. And this is something that was shown in the Jen paper as well that looked at the male-female disadvantage with regard to something happening at the middle school level of education. So it takes until at least middle school to actually sort of have additional gains, even for the classes that are disadvantaged. So in conclusion, we find that men and women experience different patterns. Men get married and have children much later than women. And men, as all but one class reported having children in adulthood. For women, early marriage and childbearing appeared to drive cognitive disadvantage, but for men, it appeared to come from child labor and potentially teenage childbearing. And for both men and women, belonging to the most disadvantaged class continues to be associated with the lower late life cognition, even after controlling for education and other factors. And for some of these other classes that were in the middle of the spectrum, the association is no longer significant after adjusting for education and other factors. And the predicted margins basically show us, when we look at between education and class membership, show us that for both men and women, after attainment of 8 or 9 years of education, each additional year of education is consistently associated with greater improvements in cognition for the worse off classes relative to the advantaged class. That's all I have for today. Thank you.